You built something that worked, a career, a reputation, a way of being useful. And then, almost quietly, something shifted. Not overnight, but enough to make you ask a question you wouldn't have asked 10 years ago. If machines can now do what I spent decades learning, what exactly is left of me? It doesn't show up as panic. Not at first. It shows up in small moments. You read an article and realize you understood it slower than an algorithm summarized it. You sit in a meeting and notice the younger guy referencing tools you haven't even tried. He's not smarter, but he's faster in a way that feels unfamiliar. And then comes the quieter thought. Was my value always just efficiency? Because if it was, then yes, this feels like erosion. The kind you don't argue with. The kind that happens while everything still looks stable from the outside. You still have your position. People still respect you, but something internal is loosening. Like the ground isn't as solid as it used to be. And what makes this particularly unsettling is that it doesn't feel like failure. It feels like being bypassed. There's no clear moment you can point to and say, "That's when I lost relevance." Instead, it's a slow realization that the game itself is changing, and the skills that once made you reliable are no longer rare. For a long time, your identity wasn't just what you did. It was how long it took you to become the person who could do it. Years of pattern recognition, mistakes you learned to avoid, judgment built from repetition. That was the edge. But AI doesn't need repetition. It compresses experience. And suddenly, what took you 20 years to internalize can be approximated in seconds. Not perfectly, but close enough to make people question the difference. And that's where the real tension begins. Because it's not just about competence, it's about meaning. If effort is no longer visible, does mastery still feel earned? If outcomes can be generated without the process, what happens to the identity built around that process? There's a strange contradiction here. You're more experienced than ever. And yet, in certain rooms, you feel less essential. Not because you've declined, but because the environment no longer measures value the same way. That's a difficult thing to metabolize, especially if your sense of self was built on being the one who knows. Now, you're surrounded by tools that know faster, and the instinctive reaction is to resist that, to dismiss it, to say it lacks depth, nuance, real-world understanding. And sometimes that's true. But here's the question that lingers underneath. Even if it's shallow, what if it's sufficient? That's the unsettling part. Because sufficiency, in most systems, replaces excellence, not because it's better, but because it's cheaper, faster, more scalable. And suddenly, your depth feels excessive. There's a moment many men don't talk about. When they realize they're no longer optimizing for success, they're negotiating with obsolescence, quietly, internally, without language for it. It doesn't feel like fear exactly. It feels like disorientation, like walking into a room where the rules have changed, but no one announced it. And you're expected to just adapt. But adapt into what? Because this isn't only about AI. AI is just the mirror. It reflects something that was already fragile. The idea that your worth was tied to output, to being needed, to being the one who delivers. And when something else can deliver faster, it exposes how narrow that definition was. Here's the paradox. What feels like becoming irrelevant might actually be the first time you're being asked to redefine relevance. Not in terms of speed, not in terms of volume, but in terms of orientation. What do you see that others don't notice yet? Not because you're quicker, but because you've lived through enough cycles to recognize patterns that don't show up in data immediately. AI is powerful at answering questions, but it doesn't choose which questions matter. That still requires a kind of judgment that isn't easily automated. And yet, this doesn't fully resolve the discomfort, because part of you still misses the clarity of the old role. You knew where you stood. You knew how to measure yourself. Now it's more ambiguous. Less about proving, more about positioning. And that shift can feel like loss, even if it's actually a transition. There's also something else happening. At 45 and beyond, you're not just competing with machines, you're also confronting time. Not in a dramatic sense, but in the quiet awareness that you don't have infinite runway to reinvent yourself endlessly. So the pressure feels different. It's not urgency, it's precision. You don't want to chase everything new, but you also don't want to become rigid. That tension is where many men get stuck, either rejecting change entirely or trying to imitate younger behaviors that don't quite fit. Neither feels honest. So what does? Maybe it's this. Instead of asking, how do I stay relevant in this new system? A different question emerges. What kind of relevance is actually worth maintaining? Because not all relevance is equal. Some of it is just visibility. Some of it is noise. And some of it is the ability to see clearly when others are moving too fast to notice what they're doing. AI accelerates everything, but acceleration reduces reflection. And reflection is where meaning stabilizes. You've spent decades building that capacity, not as a skill you listed on a resume, but as a way of being. The ability to pause, to contextualize, to notice second-order effects. That doesn't disappear. It just becomes less obvious in a culture that rewards immediacy. So yes, there is a loss here. Certain advantages you once had are no longer exclusive. That's real. But it's not the whole picture. Because what's emerging isn't a world where experience is useless. It's a world where experience has to express itself differently. Less as authority, more as perspective, less as control, more as discernment. And that transition doesn't come with applause. It's quiet, internal, sometimes even invisible to others, which makes it harder to trust. But maybe that's the deeper shift. Moving from being validated externally to becoming internally coherent. Not because the world stopped needing you, but because the way it needs you is no longer as obvious. And maybe that's why this feels so unsettling, because it asks you to let go of a version of yourself that worked extremely well in order to become someone whose value isn't immediately measurable. That's not a downgrade, but it doesn't feel like an upgrade either. It feels like standing in between. Not who you were, not yet who you're becoming. And there's no clear map for that space. Just a series of small recognitions, moments where you notice that what you bring isn't speed, but clarity. Not output, but direction. Not answers, but better questions. And slowly, that begins to matter again, just in a different way than before. Quieter, less visible, but maybe more stable.